Welcome to the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. As a surviving sibling myself, I knew that I wanted to share my story, my brother's story. I lost my brother to a homicide in November 2016. And after going through this experience, I knew that I wanted to share my story and his story. And it's taken me quite some time to come to the mic to tell it, but I knew it was an important one to tell. So here I am to share his story and mine with you. And it's important that I tell the story of the surviving sibling, the forgotten mourner, the story that is not told enough. So thank you for coming with me on this journey, and thank you for listening to my story. After returning home from the hospital, I felt so lost. After dropping my father off at the hotel and returning home with my mother and her boyfriend and my youngest sister and her husband, I had this condo in the city and my house was full and my heart was just empty. And I knew I was sleep deprived. And I guess unless you've really gone through this, it's difficult to understand it completely, or you definitely can't describe it. But the best way to describe what I was going through at that moment was I felt so many different things. I felt sad and confused and lost and devastated and just so alone. Even though I was surrounded physically by people, I felt alone still. And at the same time, I felt nothing at all. I felt so numb. And I think there was this thing in my head, I was just kind of stuck in me and in my soul, that if I went to sleep, it made this so much more real. And that was really a theme that carried throughout during my time in the hospital with my brother too, and losing him and having to walk away. And I felt like if I went to sleep, it was going to become even more real. And now I would have to sleep away from his physical body for the first time since I discovered this news and saw him pass essentially and left the room. And it would just make it too real. And looking back on it years later, that does make sense to me. I can understand why I would think that or why I would feel that way. But in the moment, it's like you're fighting these two different sides where you're numb and you're coping, and then you're also just kind of lost. You're just so lost in all these emotions and you don't even know what you should be feeling. And I remember everyone needed to rest, but we needed to lift our spirits. And I almost feel like, if you believe in this, maybe you can relate, but I almost feel like my brother was kind of coming through me, or he was with me at this time, because he was really a jokester and kind of the comedian of the family, and also kind of the gossiper of the family, which I'll talk about throughout this podcast. But I remember putting together kind of like, if you watch the show Parks and Rec, like Know Your Boo, I put together this show, but like game show. So my mother and her boyfriend and my sister and her husband could play this in my living room, and we could all have like a little drink and kind of just loosen the tension up a little bit, or sadness, or make light of this. And I think, and of course not light of the loss, but just how heavy the whole situation was. And also, it was really uncomfortable being around my mother and her boyfriend. His name is George. And it was just odd. And I really wanted to just, have a little fun. And that was definitely my brother. That's definitely how my brother would have dealt with the situation. Again, looking back on that now, I realize like, oh, wow, because that's not always how I would have dealt with something. I would have probably wanted to stay up and talk, or just kind of be alone and deal with it in a different way. I realize now I wanted to talk to my dad. But I did this game show, and it was interesting because that's when a lot of this stuff came out about my mother and George. Because my sister and her husband, my youngest sister, they got married quite young. She was just barely 19 and he was quite young too. They're around the same age. if not the same age. And we were all very concerned about that. I supported her, though. I did. And I hope she still feels that way to this day. But I was still concerned. There was no way in my life, if I had married the guy that I was with at 19, that we would have made it or still be together. It was a very toxic relationship that I was in. But I'm also old enough now to realize, and was at the time when she went through that situation, that everybody's different. Everybody's situation is very different. And I actually, as I've spoken about already on the podcast, I actually very much like her husband. I think he's a good man. So it was interesting, though, as we got this know your boo or newlywed kind of game started, because they crushed it, my sister and her husband, and they could still be considered newlyweds, in my opinion. I think that was the same year they got married. I don't know. It's so crazy how time flies. So yeah, they were still newlyweds. I think that's why I thought of doing this game. And my mother and her boyfriend, again, there was a lot of uncertainty about what this relationship actually was. But I wanted to come from a good place and have fun, and this guy had been there. George had been there in the hospital, and I had a moment with him in the hospital where he was kind of talking to me and calming me down, and I couldn't really read this guy. I couldn't really figure it out, and my mother had told me stories, and I had been privy to some phone calls in the past which had strained our relationship, of toxicity in their relationship from what I heard. But I didn't know him, and so all I knew was that he was there. And when people are there during a difficult time, I think you give them a shot, you give them a chance. And so this is making me emotional talking about this, I don't know, but I think it is really important when you have people that are there, you give them a shot. And so we were playing this game, but it was enlightening because my mother and George did not answer each other's questions. They didn't know, which was interesting to me because I think they had been living together on and off. And it was pretty much the first red flag. I mean, some of these, the murmurings in the hospital that they weren't really together, or there was confusion about the relationship. I wasn't really focused on that at the time. I was focused on my brother and just being there as long as I could be with him. But when you're getting back into a situation where you're removed from that scene, you can start to look at what's happening in the ecosystem of the loss. And I was really surprised by this because, a young newlywed couple, 19, 20-year-olds, them struggling with some questions, that's going to happen. I think my husband and I might even do that. And we've been married for a couple of years now. And I'm in my 30s and he's going to be 40. And so I look at that now back and I go, wow, that was kind of telling, because when you're older and you're in a relationship, you're just more open and you just know yourself better. And my husband and I know each other very, very well. And so I was very blown away by that. And it was one of the first things that just told me something's not right here. But I am glad that we did that and kind of lifted everyone's spirits. And my mother and George went and slept in the master, which was my room, of course. And my sister and her husband slept with their sweet little dog in my spare bedroom / my office, because I lived in the city. I didn't have a huge home at the time. And I sat on the couch all night and I just stared. Not really sure what I did. I just kind of stared at the time. And it was already quite late when we had returned home, and then we played this game. So everyone went to bed very, very late. And I think I just waited for an appropriate time to leave the home, to get out of there, because I needed to be with someone. I needed to be alone. I didn't know what I needed. I just didn't. And I think it's important to know, as someone that's lost a sibling myself, and if you're listening to this and you've lost a sibling, I'm assuming you have, or you know someone, you don't always know what you need right away. And this is for loss in general. You don't know. And I literally was so lost. I went and got lost. I left the home at 5:30, between 5:30 and 6:30, from what I recall. And I just started walking. And I walked to my father's hotel, which was the Hilton downtown in Atlanta. So now you guys can stalk me, you know where I live. Bring some levity to this. And I was just walking. It wasn't too far of a walk, but it was cold. And Georgia's interesting, Atlanta too, because November you can be wearing a t-shirt and it can be super hot, or it can be super cold. It can be actually be winter. And it was cold, and I remember wearing this beautiful fur kind of coat, black coat that I have, and walking the streets in the morning. And I got to his hotel and I went up and we had breakfast in the room together, and we were just talking. I think I may have even had like a mimosa or something, and just talked. And that conversation in that room with him was really comforting. I remember him telling me some things, and then some things I don't remember, because I remember the exhaustion finally hitting me in the sense that like I was getting tired. And I think it was because I started to feel some kind of comfort. And maybe you can relate to this, but I think when you feel like you can rest a little bit is when you feel like there's some comfort or some solace or something there. And I started to feel that. I mean, did I eat much? No, I think I ate like a couple strawberries or pineapples or something, because I was just not there. But I remember my father telling me, like, you're exhausted, you need to rest. That was a big part of the conversation. Whoever did this to your brother, which we saw pictures of this guy, like we knew who it was, but we didn't know him. But he said, look, regardless, because I was kind of on a warpath already. I wanted this guy to pay, already starting down the path of revenge already, and I hadn't even gotten a wink of sleep. That's me. I'm an intense person, and I just love that hard. And my father was telling me, look, this guy has to live with this for the rest of his life, what he did, regardless of what happened. And at the time, it would get me fired up, because I was like, no, Dad, you got to understand, he's got to pay for this. And we were able to come to kind of terms at the time of just respecting each other's perspective. And I didn't realize that was my dad's way of coping in the moment. And I didn't realize at the time that didn't mean that he wasn't going to care about it. I think I had this big fear, and it was legitimate, that everyone was just going to not care. And this was just going to go, quote unquote, go away. And it wasn't going to go away. It wasn't going anywhere. This was so real. This happened. We lost someone. We lost someone that was so important. I lost my only brother. He lost his only son. So it became very emotional. And I remember him telling me, I'm going to walk you back. You need to rest. And I agreed to it. I felt like it was a good place. It was very emotional. And so we walked back, and I remember my dad doesn't have the best health choices in the world. He definitely likes to drink some good wine, and he likes to go to gin and tonic, but his biggest vice is definitely smoking. He's European, has smoked I don't even know how long, and still does. I wish he didn't. And so we stepped outside of the hotel, and I kind of put my hand out as he was smoking. And he's like, no, I'm not going to give you this crap. He said, obviously another choice word. And I said, no. I said, I don't care. Come on, I lost my brother. Let's have a cigarette together. And he was not thrilled about it, but we did. And so we walked back and we smoked together. And we had together in New York in the past. And it's a funny memory too, because I remember telling him that I had quit smoking years and years and years ago. I quit smoking when I was 21, but I started smoking because I used to take his cigarette when I was 13 and stuff. And so I kind of was telling him these stories as we were walking. And I think I had told him some of it before in New York, and it was kind of bringing, again, some levity to the conversation. And I remember him saying, oh, crap. Again, he's using choice words, not that. Realizing that he had done this a little bit. But it was a solemn walk, but also there were these moments of light, and the sun came out, and it was cold, but the sun came out, and he kind of just kept talking to me about how to move forward. And again, with every step, I started to feel like I was sinking into my exhaustion. I was sinking into a release a little bit, like it was okay for me to let go of the control that I was trying to hold on to. And that's something that's challenging for me to do. It's something that I've grown a lot with in the past 5+ years. So by the time we returned to the condo, everybody was starting to get up or wake up, and it was getting closer to a brunch time at that time. And my father literally put me to bed. He was like, get in the bed, because everyone had woken up so I could get in the master. And all I wanted to do at that time is I wanted to be with my dog. I wanted my little Scarlet. And I knew why. I started to realize why. I mean, one, I love dogs. I've always loved animals. They're comforting. I think they are wonderful, wonderful creatures that sometimes we just don't deserve as humans. But Scarlet was really significant between my brother and I, because when I got her in October of 2012, my brother actually came with me to go get her. And she was in this random area of southern Georgia that I had never been to, kind of like the middle of southern Georgia. I'd been to the east side, west side. I went to school at Valdosta, so been down there, been to Savannah, but this was kind of like smack dab in the middle, very, very south. And when my brother and I arrived, this was back again in 2012, was this place. It almost seemed like a puppy mill. My brother and I to this day still think it was. And him and I kind of just looked at each other. I'll never forget looking at him. That look of like, oh crap, like what is this? Like, where are we? And we went in, and he was actually the first one to hold Scarlet. And she was all of like 2 pounds at the time, and I was signing the paperwork. And he, being the unapologetic person that he is and totally unfiltered, goes, what's wrong with her eye? He's like holding her. And they're telling me, oh, it's allergies. You just give her a little bit of this gel. She'll be fine. My intuition right away was like, something's off here. And my brother was like, something's off here. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm in love with her. She's so cute. He's like, I am too. We'll keep an eye on it. So we get back in my car, and he takes a few pictures of us together. So those pictures are very near and dear to my heart too, because he took them. And she didn't sit with me. She sat with him in the car all the way home. And she, you know, dogs sometimes get sick for the first time in the car, and it was like a 4 or 5 hour drive. And she just slept on him the whole time. It was the cutest thing. And for those of you who know me or follow me on social media, or my dogs, you know that she has had a struggle with her eye and actually doesn't produce tears in that eye. But almost 10 years later, we found her proper medical care. Shout out to University of Georgia. And my brother actually was the one to see that and identify that ahead of time and knew right away. So Scarlet was just, and is still to this day, such a therapeutic aspect of my life and connection in my life, and I wanted her back. She was still staying with my friends. And I remember I kept saying that as I was delirious and being put to bed, put to sleep. And, you know, I've been prescribed medications by the doctors to sleep, Klonopin, you know, the anti-anxiety medications, but nothing was working. Nothing helped. It was really just knowing that I could have that kind of release and those moments and those talks and kind of like the permission, I guess is the best way to say it, to release and to let go and to sleep finally. Like, it was okay to do that. And I kind of felt that overcome me finally. And my father told me, and my mother, they were both in there. I think George was too. And they said that, I mean, I was so exhausted. They said that they would get Scarlet and they would bring her back when they were going to run errands. And so they left. And I remember kind of just taking the covers and curling up, and I cried. But it wasn't long, because I just crashed like into, I'm sure this has happened to you in your life. And if you've lost, you know, when you're so exhausted, you finally just kind of give out. And it's just like, it's an intense sleep. Like, it's like a blackout. Like, all of a sudden my eyes were open and it was dark in the home. So, but it wasn't crazy late because it's wintertime, and I could hear jovial speech and conversation coming from the kitchen, and I didn't know if I had slept for 2 days, 5 minutes. I realized it was probably more than 5 minutes since it was dark, unless they had installed blackout curtains or something. But I was like, wow. And then when I looked at my phone, I was like, okay, I've slept a couple hours. Like, finally, I want to say I felt refreshed, but I kind of didn't. I felt so out of it. It was like I was on medication or something, because I was still so tired, and that was such a deep like sleep, like a sleep of like complete darkness, like where you don't dream or anything, just an exhaustive sleep. But I wanted to get up. I wanted to be around people. I thought I didn't want to be in the room anymore. And so I got up and I guess made myself presentable enough in my mind. I'm sure I looked like a wreck, and came out, and the lights were kind of dimmed in my dining room, and my mom and George were there, and my sister and her husband, and Scarlett was back now. And my father wasn't there. He was at his hotel. And they were all kind of laughing and having fun around the table. And there were bottles of wine out, so they had been drinking wine. And it made me happy to see that. It made me happy to see that they were enjoying time. And, there was, again, I use this word a lot, but some levity to the situation and some happiness in the moment. And so I kind of joined the room, and I remember them asking me, I believe it was George, hey, you want a glass of wine? And I said, yeah, sure. I felt so out of it, but I said, sure. And so I sat there and I was kind of just observing what was going on. And there were some just kind of conversations happening and talking a little bit about my brother. We were talking a little bit about just life, and everything was okay. Conversations were fine. And then the conversation took a really weird turn, and I wasn't prepared to walk into this, and it was getting weird. And my mother's boyfriend, George, was talking about how my mother liked these younger men, and oh God, at the time it would have been whatever that artist was, but Justin Bieber or something like that. And it was getting really awkward. It was getting really weird. And I'm like, why are we talking about a weird topic? I am exhausted. We've just lost a family member that we all love and care about. This is weird. This is weird. And it almost didn't feel real. I almost was like, am I still asleep? What's going on? And the discussion between my mother and her boyfriend started to get heated. And he started to accuse her of hitting on younger men when they had been out. And it was just my suspicions of the relationship were starting to be confirmed. And I didn't really want my sister, she was 20 at the time. I didn't want her to be privy to that. And I didn't want her husband. And it was just, it was not good. And so I asked them to take the dogs for a walk, their dog and mine, little Scar, and their dog Cash. And so it was kind of getting heated, but it hadn't gotten that bad yet. And so they left and they walked around the corner, around the neighborhood. It was not crazy late, so it's safe, it's fine. And I just was sitting there in shock going, why are we talking about such trivial stuff? So the two of them start having conversation with me about all the problems in their relationship. And I'm sitting there just taking sips of my wine going, what the hell is happening right now? I lost my brother, literally walked away from him less than 24 hours ago. Why is this happening? And why was I chastised for bringing a really great man that I'm seeing to help in the hospital? And you two are clearly not even together. So then it escalates even more, and my mother starts throwing slings at him and verbal slings at him, and they're fighting, and it's clear and evident that they had not really been together. He had been doing laundry at my house, which is fine. I didn't mind that, but the laundry room was at the back of my kitchen, and he proceeds to get up because he's really angry, and they're both angry at each other. It sounds like there was infidelity. I don't know their relationship, but it was very toxic, and this had turned into all about them in my home. And I was disgusted. And this will happen. This will happen in loss. I've learned this through other people, but at the time I had no idea this is what happens. I'm I just had a whole conversation with my mother days earlier. We need to come together. This is about, I was just devastated and still tired and thought this was a dream. And he went over to the dryer, and my kitchen was kind of long, and had like this breakfast nook that went into the dining room, and he is so angry at her, and she's looking at me for, I guess, like, confirmation, support, and I'm looking at her going like, yeah, this guy's like nuts. Like, he's like, why did you bring him here? And I'm trying to talk to her and understand why this happened. And she's like mortified looking at me, and he's chucking laundry at her from across the kitchen. And at that point I was like, this is enough. I'm like, you've got to get out of here. I'm like, go pack your bags. This is not about you. This is about our family. I thought you were here together. Like, you need to go. And so he storms off into the master and packs his bag. And my mother tells me, like, they hadn't really been together. She admits it. And that they had this tumultuous relationship. And I was in shock. That it was absolutely true. Like, she just wanted him to be there for her and come. And I don't know that that was necessarily wrong, but I think it was wrong to mislead people, and I think it was wrong to bring someone that was clearly not mentally well and put them in that situation because they made it all about themselves. And as she's expressing all of this upset and hurt and anger, I told her, I said, you've got to leave this guy. Like, this is it. Like, she had moved up to another area of the country, and I had helped her, get a job with a previous company I was with. And I said, you went up there to start a beautiful life, and, you're an empty nester. Why did you do this? I was so confused, and I was even more upset that we're even discussing it at this point. But she followed him into the master bedroom, and they were arguing, and it was physical. And I told him, I said, you've got a couple minutes and you got to go. Like, I have an HOA, like, I have neighbors. But first and foremost, like, you're not going to put my family in physical danger, and you're not going to make this situation about you. And he continued, and he wouldn't leave. And so I took his bag and I threw it out of my home, and I said, you need to leave. And he stormed out, and he was furious. And my mom was very distraught afterwards, and I had a lot of empathy for her. She had been through, and has been through, a lot of relationships. I've watched this pretty much my whole life, that were not functional, and all I've ever wanted for her was to be in happy, functional, happy, good relationships. And I think all she's ever really wanted was that for herself, to really feel like the great love and the happiness in her life. And I think there are moments of that for her, but I think there's a lot of this. And it was so sad to see that the person that she was with or not with, there's still no clarity on that to this day, that they were doing such things to her in the most traumatic moment, I'm sure, of her life and of her children's life. And that breaks my heart to this day. Really does. Regardless of how I feel about her decisions or her anything, she's my mother, and I love her, and I want the best for her. And that was heartbreaking to watch. And I sat there and I talked to her for a long time that night and wanted her to be strong. And my sister and my brother-in-law returned with the dogs, and they had seen George outside, and he had actually confronted them and spoken to them and said things to them, and which I just found so crazy. But he was going to get a flight back and leave. Great. Like, that was a good plan. That was going to mitigate the situation. And so I remember sleeping next to my mom that night, and he was just blowing her phone up. It was so toxic what was happening, and it was breaking my heart. It really was, because that's not what this was about. It's not the focus, and I couldn't even deal with it. Like, I couldn't. And I just told her, I said, you don't have to deal with this either. Like, you don't. Like, you need to be focused on how you're feeling and, what you're going through with your son. Like, this is so messed up. So the next day was Thanksgiving. So this was an action-packed week. It was a tough week. And we had actually booked a reservation because none of us were going to cook, even though we were so blessed because who I had worked for in the past, a VP at a company I've worked for, who my mom was working for at the time, he sent us, like, I don't even know how many dinners on dinners of Thanksgiving. I mean, it probably could have fed the entire, condo complex I lived in at the time. So generous. It was just so kind how they treated her and my family and, my work as well. And everyone at the time, but we were in no state of mind to do that. So, my mother and my father and my sister and I and her husband, we went to dinner, and it was a family dinner, and we talked about my brother and talked about really positive things, and I try to treasure that moment. I really do. It was really happy to know that my father and my mom could sit down at the same table, because my father has remarried and he has another family, and my mom has this situation going on, and her boyfriend George was calling her nonstop, blowing her up, and I could see the pressure cooking. I could see the things going on. And of course there was drinking and alcohol involved at the dinner, and things escalated, and to my knowledge, apparently the story was told that I threw George out, and I was the person that did these terrible things. And my father, when we returned from Thanksgiving, was furious. He was upset with me. He did not think my behavior was appropriate. My mother was the victim. She said, that I did all these horrible things. She needed to get out of there. She was crying. She was upset. And so he came to her rescue and took her items out of the house, and it became really heated. And my father screamed at me and, pushed me. That was really challenging, because it reminded me of some things that happened during childhood, and screamed about my childhood at me. And I was shook. I was totally shook. I could not believe this was happening. And I kept asking him, what are you talking about? This guy, what are you talking about? And he's, talking about how he's a great guy. I don't know what I'm talking about. It was like this big whirlwind that happened. And then they were all out of my home. And my sister and my brother-in-law, they had left and returned home. And that was it. It was like chaos and then silence. Nice dinner, chaos, nice dinner, chaos, and then silence. And I remember sitting there with Scarlett alone. I was truly alone now. And I was like, what the hell just happened? What just happened? And how am I the bad guy in all of this, in all of these narratives? And I felt so hurt. I felt betrayed by my mother when I had sat up all night talking to her about the situation. Countless times I had dealt with these situations with her boyfriends. I couldn't believe she betrayed me and twisted this story to my father. I could not believe it. I didn't know the extent of it at the time, but I knew something had happened for him to come in and get her stuff. How did that escalate that way? I was so confused. And for all of them just to leave and for him to get her a hotel room, it was mind-boggling. And I get a message. All I had was my phone, and I remember just laying on the couch staring at the TV. I had The Office on reruns because my brother loved The Office, and I think that's all I watched for a long time. And when I say a long time, I'm talking weeks on end. But at this moment, I remember I got a message the next day, which would have been Friday, on WhatsApp finally, because my father lives abroad. And he says to me, we're going on a trip, or we're going somewhere, or we're going to see your sisters. We'll be back, because my sisters, each one lived in Jacksonville, one lived in Savannah at the time. Very little information. I might be embellishing on that information, actually. I don't even know that he told me they were going there. And my understanding was it was him and my mother. And I remember just feeling like everything was being taken from me. I didn't really have my family in my life like that, but I didn't know if I was going to get my brother's ashes. I didn't know if I would be at this whatever ceremony my mother was going to put together, because she was doing a lot of things that my brother would not have wanted. He really wanted to be celebrated. He wanted people to know about him, and she didn't want people to know. So it was very anti what my brother would have wanted with a lot of things. There's some things she did very well, but some things were just so not spot on and not what he would have wanted. He was definitely the most extroverted in the family. I'm a close second, but he is way more extroverted, and he wanted to be out there. He wanted people to know who he was. He was all over the internet. He had tons of people that knew him, and I just didn't agree with her in this, only letting a few people know that he passed, and there were so many things here. But my biggest fear was that I wouldn't have a little piece of him, or I wouldn't be a part of this, and I wouldn't get to say, like, anything about him or get to speak his truth or anything about that. I was afraid I wouldn't get to see his girlfriend again, the family again, and get to thank them for everything that they did. So much set in. The anxiety was real. I think that couch was like just shaking for days straight. And so at that point, I didn't know. I didn't know when I would see them again. All I had was a message, and all I had was time to wait. And all I had to do, or all I could do, was hope. All I could do was hope that I would hear. And I was so confused. I didn't understand. I had no understanding or at all about why I had been villainized in this situation. But it would become evident very soon. But in the time that I sat there waiting, staring at the office, the gentleman I was dating at the time, he did come over and see me. I don't remember eating. I think I had sparkling water next to me at all times, and so I drank that from time to time. I drink a little wine from time to time to sleep, and I just remember staring at the back of that couch, that white cream couch I had, and dozing in and out when I could, taking the medication that my doctor had given me for my anxiety. It didn't work. When you're at that kind of level, it just doesn't work from my experience. I hope it does for you if you find yourself in that experience, but it didn't for me. And I felt completely powerless. And I think I look back on that now and realize that was a lesson from whatever you believe in, God, the universe, in letting go and realizing that we don't have power over everything. I mean, that was definitely a lesson when I lost my brother, but in this moment, this was such a lesson because I couldn't do anything. I knew, we had donated his organs. I had no idea who was going to get them. I would never be told that information. I knew where he was being cremated, but I didn't know if I was going to get that information. I knew that, if I had any shot at finding out anything, I was going to have to play nice with my mom and I guess now my dad, because I didn't understand what had been told or what. I was so confused. And here I was. It makes me emotional to talk about it to this day still. I was abandoned, and none of them will ever understand. My family will never understand what I saw, the pain I went through, my story, watching my brother go through what he went through, even watching his girlfriend go through what she went through. She saw way more than they did. And then to just be abandoned after being there for my mother during such a dysfunctional situation. Abandonment is definitely something that my brother struggled with, and it's definitely something that I've struggled with in my life, and I healed a whole lot from that up until that situation. I felt abandoned because my brother died. That's not something he could control, but then I felt abandoned by my family, and I was abandoned by them, and I could not understand why people would just leave you like that in such a time. I was devastated, especially after the fact that my father had been there for me. It was the most confusing thing to me, like what had been said, what had been told. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was trying to protect my mother. I was trying to protect my sister. I was trying to protect my brother-in-law, the dogs, and myself. This man was clearly not a good man, and he had a bad track record as well. People didn't know what I knew. I had fielded calls from my mother throughout their relationship where she had told me that he was doing things to her in the past, which contributed to the rockiness of our relationship because it was not a good relationship for her. And so it really broke my heart. Like, what had happened where I was laying on a couch, not eating, waiting for a WhatsApp message, where all I could do was just hope that I would be able to participate and be able to understand how something could change so quickly, again, in less than 24 hours. Thank you so much for listening to the Surviving Siblings podcast. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did creating it for you, then share it on your chosen social media platform. And don't forget to tag us at Surviving Siblings Podcast so that more surviving siblings can find us. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And don't forget to follow us on all social media platforms. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Surviving Siblings Podcast. All links can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out too. Thank you again for the support. Until the next episode, keep on surviving, my surviving siblings.